confirmation bias, just if you have a view of the world, you will accept anything that supports that viewpoint and reject something that contradicts it. But what if you don't have a pre-existing view of the world? And that's where the second bias comes in, which is black and white thinking. If I think in binary terms, I will think that something has to be either always good or always bad. And so those two collectively can account for the vast majority of misinformation that we see. Alfred Slow, who was CEO of GM, there was a meeting and he asked, well, this is my idea, this is how I want to move forward. Does anybody have an objection to my plan? And there was a silence. And then he said, well, there's no objections. Well, then let's postpone the decision until the next meeting so that you've had a chance to come up with some concerns.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today I'm going to be chatting to the author of a book that I just came across a few months ago called May Contain Lies. And this is a very, very powerful book for a number of reasons. But the reason I'm most interested in is because it very much lines up with the insights and ideas that I talk about when I mention inner propaganda, how we persuade ourselves of certain things, even though they might not necessarily be true. So I'm joined by the author, Alex Edmans. Alex is a professor of finance in London Business School. He has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright scholar, and he's also a former tenured professor at Wharton, used to be an investment banker at Morgan Stanley as well. He's spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and his TED Talk has been seen by more than 2 million people. It's What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. So any of you who know me know exactly why I've asked Alex to come on the podcast. Alex dives into two particular biases, which we're going to get into, along with incredible framework that he has. Anyway, Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Owen, and thank you for such a warm introduction. So after spending a couple of years of my life writing your book, I'm really grateful when people don't just read it themselves, but are willing to share it with their platform. So thank you.
100%. And look, I'm selfishly sharing it on my platform because it also aligns very much with the same kind of ideas I'm trying to put across. But I want to get straight into it. One of the things that you do so well, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the writing process later, but one of the things you do so well, Alex, is you're able to structure things in a really clear, clean way. When you look at this process of all of the ways in which we're biased, all the ways in which we are influenced by what goes on, how did you cut it down to just these two most important elements, confirmation bias and black and white thinking?
So what I really like as a researcher, as an author and a speaker, is to distill complex concepts into simple frameworks without dumbing it down, but while making it more accessible to a general audience. And there's lots of biases out there. So to write a book about the 257 biases you can see on Wikipedia's list of biases, that would be difficult to remember and put into practice. So I wanted to think about what are the main biases that exist and affect us in terms of responding to information. So there are some minor biases. So one of them is called the rhyme as reason effect. We're much more likely to believe rhyming phrases. So one famous one was, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, which is attributed to getting O.J. Simpson off a potential incarceration. Similarly, you cannot be who you cannot see. That's also something where people believe it, even though there's no evidence behind it because it rhymes. But that's something minor. So I thought, well, that only applies in a small set of contexts. What are the major biases that exist in nearly all contexts? And so I thought of confirmation bias, which is if you have a view of the world, you will accept anything that supports that viewpoint and reject something that contradicts it. But what if you don't have a pre-existing view of the world? And that's where the second bias comes in, which is black and white thinking. Even if I don't have a preconceived view, if I think in a black and white way, if I think in binary terms, I will think that something has to be either always good or always bad. Now, I'm agnostic before looking at the evidence, but when I see the evidence, it's going to skew me either completely one way or completely the other. So those biases between them, one of them confirmation bias that exists if there's something you already have a viewpoint over, and the second black and white thinking that exists even if you don't have a pre-existing view, and so those two collectively can account for the vast majority of misinformation that we see.
I love that answer. And I also love the fact that you're trying to account for so many different biases inside of those too, because I think ultimately speaking, what is a bias? But it's a shortcut in our thinking that often trips us up, but sometimes could actually prove useful. One of the things that I spend a lot of time about is trying to understand why the brain engages in the biases that it has. And so if you take, for example, confirmation bias, or you also look at black and white thinking, both of them are very effective ways at reducing the amount of energy your brain has to use in order to be able to figure out the situation. And I think a lot of the problems or mistakes we make at the moment would be on lazy thinking. Our brain likes to conserve energy, so therefore uses or leverages confirmation bias, or this confirmation bias leverages black and white thinking to make it nice and simple. You also talk about the narrative fallacy, and this is like our ability to be able to create cause and effects between different things so we can fit them in a nice little neat story that's coherent, because our brain likes coherence, to make it, again, easy for us to, consider and think about. But where I'd love to go with you is, I've seen something that you do with confirmation bias that I loved more than most people talk about it. It's a very well-known bias. But what you did was you broke it down into a couple of different types of confirmation bias, and then you even broke one of those into two more. I would love you to just to share with the audience how you were able to break it down into these are a number of different ways in which we leverage confirmation bias.
Thanks, Owen. And this is something I really enjoy doing, is breaking something which seems broad and sweeping into bite-sized chunks, because when we can do this, then as the reader, I can remember the different ways in which confirmation bias can manifest. So what are the three ways? Well, first, there is biased search, which is I will only look for information which confirms what I think will be true. So if I'm a right-wing person, I might watch Fox News, or in the UK, I might read the Daily Mail. If I'm a left-wing person, I might watch MSNBC, or in the UK, I might read The Guardian. So we follow people, we read things that are confirming what we would like to be true, which make us feel good. Then there's the second type of confirmation bias, which is biased interpretation. What do we do when there's information which is given to us? So even if I'm not actively searching for something, maybe a friend sends me a particular report, how am I going to interpret this? Now, biased interpretation itself comes in two forms, which is why we have those three forms. One form of biased interpretation is what I call naive acceptance. I accept something uncritically because I want it to be true. So let's say there was a study which claims that ethnic diversity improves financial performance. Me, being an ethnic minority, will think, oh, this must be true. Let me tweet it from the rooftops. Let me share this to everybody in order to advance the case for ethnic diversity. I won't bother to question, how did they measure performance? Was it short-term performance? Was it long-term performance? I won't even question what's driving what. Is it ethnic diversity that drives better performance? Or once the company is already performing well, then it can start paying attention towards increasing diversity because it's not firefighting as much. I will just accept the narrative that I want to be true and tell everybody else. Now, the flip side to naive acceptance is blinkered skepticism, where I want to dismiss something just because it's an inconvenient truth. And that's something which can have quite serious implications, even fatal, life or death implications. So one example is Deepwater Horizon, where a rig which was leased by BP exploded, it killed people, it damaged tons of coastline and spilled many barrels of oil into the sea. So why did they remove the rig when it wasn't safe? Well, because they thought it was safe. But didn't they do tests to check it was safe? Well, they did. They did some tests, and the test said it was not safe. But they had blinkered skepticism. They thought, well, let's try to come up with a reason for why we could ignore those failed tests. They invented something called a bladder effect. And they said, oh, because of this bladder effect, this test is unreliable. Let me do a different type of test. That different test passed. They thought the rig was safe, and then it exploded. And then afterwards, there was an investigation into this disaster, and the independent investigators said there is no such thing as a bladder effect. No reasonable person could have come up with this as an explanation, But when confirmation bias was so strong, and when Deepwater Horizon was the best performing rig in BP's history, people just could not get their head around the idea that this rig could be unsafe, and so that's why they dismissed evidence which should have been clear-cut.
I think one of the things that it strikes me, obviously, and you mentioned this as well, but the importance of motivated reasoning needs to be looked at here. And I think a lot of the problems that we have at the moment in the world, the fact that people have different perspectives over the same issue, oftentimes it comes down to a number of things. We believe what we feel is true, or we believe what we want to be true, and therefore we have a phenomenal skill to be able to rationalize and reason our way to the conclusion. And one of the things I like about motivated reasoning is the notion that we're really trying to either optimize for accuracy and truth, or we're trying to optimize for certainty. And when we optimize for certainty, we're looking to make it so that we're using logic or logical reasoning or argumentation as a lawyer, as an attorney, to try to find our conclusion. When we look at it and we use it in the other way, we're more like scientists. But even in science, you could have motivated reasoning where, I've seen studies which show, if you drink wine every day, if you drink a pint of Guinness every day, it's really good for your heart. And you're like, oh, great. Doesn't tell you anything about the rest of your body. But what I'd love to hear from you is, what are your thoughts around the nature of objectivity when it comes to something like motivated reasoning? How can you be sure that you are not falling into the trap of motivated reasoning, which allows you to start to use the kind of techniques like confirmation bias or blinkered skepticism and whatnot? What are the kinds of things that we can do to guard against the trap, the allure of motivated reasoning in the world today?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is just actually to recognize that you have a bias. So they say, well, the first step to addressing an addiction is to understand that you have an addiction to begin with. And you might think, well, that's a bit big, sort of comparing a bias to an addiction, but it's actually not that extreme. Why? Because people have looked at the neuroscience behind biases, and it's actually not too different from an addiction. So when we see evidence we like, it releases dopamine in our bloodstream. It just really feels good. And when we see something we don't like, it triggers the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that induces a fight or flight response. So just like we will have a neurological response to a substance we're addicted to, we also have a response to information that we like or information that we don't. So first, to recognize that it might be dopamine, which is triggering our willingness to believe something rather than rational thinking. Once you recognize that, then that might at least be the first start towards being more discerning. Now, once you've recognized this, then what is a simple technique that we could use? Well, what we could do is we could imagine the opposite result. So let's say it's something that we want to be true. We would like to be we would like to be naively accepting. Imagine we found the opposite result. How would we try to pick it apart? So let's say I found a study which shows that ethnic diversity worsens financial performance. I didn't like that. I would argue, well, maybe they only measured financial performance over a short period of time. Or maybe it was performance that caused ethnic diversity. Once a company was performing poorly, then that shook it out of its complacency, and then it started looking for different directors. But now that I've alerted myself to potential problems, one being the sample size, how many years, and the second being reverse causality, I should then ask myself, could those same issues plague the result even though it's in the direction I want? Yes, the true data that I'm seeing shows that diversity is positively correlated with financial performance, but let's ask myself, how long-term was the performance they measured, and did they address the possibility of reverse causation? And that might be true for blinkered skepticism. If I see something that I don't like, imagine the opposite result. How would I respond to this? So if the test that BP had done had shown this was a pass, they wouldn't have said, oh, there's a bladder effect and therefore this test is unreliable, I want to do a different test. They would have taken that test seriously and removed the rig. But if you're willing to take the test seriously if it gives you a pass, you should be willing to take the test seriously if it gives you a fail, and then you should make adjustments before removing it.
I think I really like that answer, but I think one of the challenges we have is that it's part of our identity as well, our beliefs, right? So in some of the business cases you're talking about, I know a lot of the work that you do is in the business arena. What we do is we're looking at, ultimately speaking, what's going to bring the results, right? What's going to avert risks? What's going to bring the results? What's going to affect the bottom line? And oftentimes inside of businesses, as you well know, we also have different people communicating ideas, people that are more certain than they should be, right? There's the whole, Dunning-Kruger effect, as they call it, of, the person that seems like they know the most actually probably knows the least. For me, one of the things that I always look at is how do we help people to get more comfortable with challenging their biases? Because I read, as reading your book, there's certain things that I'm reading in your book that I don't want to know, right? Because I know that they're true, but I don't want them to be true. I know you teach on the growth mindset, and you've done quite a lot of work sharing the growth mindset by Professor Carol Dweck. I talk about a term I like to use called the belief growth mindset, which is the idea that you can update your beliefs, a little bit like the Bayesian, ability to look at your priors and updating your priors based upon information. What are your thoughts around the identity that we need to have in order for us to be comfortable with being wrong about things, be comfortable with being uncertain, or working in a world where we're just working with probabilities in a world where everyone seems to crave certainty?
That's a great question. I can answer this at two levels. Firstly, the individual level, and then the organizational level. So at the individual level, my goal is to be better. And being better means changing my beliefs that will really help me. So when I wrote the book, I first started with a proposal, and what you do, as I'm sure you know, Owen, is you send the proposal to various agents to see who will represent you. And the agent that I chose was the one who was most critical of the proposal, because I thought, this is the person who's got the greatest potential to improve my book. Yes, it's going to take me more effort to have a critical agent, because he's going to make me do a lot of revisions before he's even willing to send it out to publishers, but that is better than me having agents who say, well, everything that you've written is correct. So it's always to think, well, how can I be better? I want to listen to people who are going to tell me things that I don't want to hear. I will read articles that I might not agree with. So in the book, I describe how when there was the Brexit referendum, I was a strong Remainer, but I deliberately went to some talks by some Brexit supporters so that I could hear the other side. And then when you translate that to an organization, just to be as explicit and intentional as possible as trying to hear different viewpoints. Now, I have an entire chapter in the book about building smart thinking organizations. And on the face of it, some of the advice I give is admittedly common sense. You might think, well, why did I need to read this in a book? But these things are so rarely done that I think you cannot emphasize them enough. So the first will be, just as a leader of an organization, just to be as explicitly clear as possible how much you value different viewpoints. And why do you need to do this? Because often people think, well, as a follower, as a subordinate, the best thing I can do is to follow the leader. I am going to ingratiate myself by agreeing with what the leader does. But if leaders can be as explicit as possible that that's not what they want, then that will really help. Let's just give a couple of examples. One is Alfred Slow, who was CEO of GM. There was a meeting and he asked, well, this is my idea. This is how I want to move forward. Does anybody have an objection to my plan? And there was a silence. And then he said, well, there's no objections. Well, then let's postpone the decision until the next meeting so that you've had a chance to come up with some concerns. So he thought no decision he made would ever be 100% correct. So if nobody has any objections, it's not because his decision was flawless. It's just that people didn't have time to think of it. Another example is Tom Geraghty, who was the CEO of Index Group, and what he did was he hired a consultant to tell him in front of a town hall of all of his employees what he was doing wrong and how he could be a better leader. So that's pretty extreme, admittedly, but what this highlights is that he is willing to be upfront that he's far from perfect. There's many mistakes that he's making, and he is willing to hear those mistakes publicly. So if you are an employee in that organization, you should absolutely feel free to tell him how he can do things better. So anything you can do to highlight that you want to build a learning organization where people are not just yes men or yes women, where people are actively willing to challenge you, this I think would have avoided a lot of groupthink which led to issues such as Deepwater Horizon or the Silicon Valley Bank crash, or even some banks over-leveraging themselves in the financial crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things, though, is as you do that, whether it's individually or collectively, is that you also need to make sure you're keeping an eye on the confirmation bias, of course, because if I say to you, look, I'm going to go along to, let's say, the pro-Brexit talks, and I'm against Brexit, but I'm going to go along to the talks, you could still be listening to them in a particular way. Like I remember years ago, I went to North Korea, and I was on a tour just myself, but at one stage we joined with another tour. And as we were getting the education on how the Korean War really went, according to them, of course, somebody in the same group was like, oh my goodness, it didn't happen like that. So in other words, it didn't matter what they were saying, they were interpreting it straight away as being absolutely completely wrong in every way. How do you then, once you understand, once you go along to, let's say, the pro-Brexit group and you're listening to their point of view, how do you make sure that on the one hand, you're not allowing confirmation bias or disconfirmation bias in this context or blinker skepticism to stop you from actually getting any valued information where you walk away and almost have a reactance, the opposite perspective, kind of like a backfire effect, although I know that there's dubious nature of that evidence. And also at the same time, how do you then use that and make it something that's useful for you in your conversations with the folks that you're talking to when you're trying to explore whether or not Brexit was a good idea?
Yeah, this is again a good question, because otherwise I might do this for box ticking. I might do this to say, oh, look how open-minded I am. I went to these Brexit talks without it even changing my viewpoint, because I went in with a closed mind. So one thing that I advise companies, and it's not just in this context, but in the work I do on sustainability, is if you could not tell anybody you were doing it, would you still do it? And so the reason for going to the Brexit talk is not to tell everybody I'm so open-minded. Indeed, I never told anybody about this until I decided to write the book many years later. So when I attended this, it was actually genuinely for self, to inform myself. But am I doing it for the right reasons? Am I doing it to educate myself? And if I am doing it to educate myself, let me be open-minded. And why do I want to be open-minded? It's not because I think I'm such a good person I'm open-minded. It's because I'm selfish. Why is it selfish to be open-minded? Because if I am a strong Remainer, I want to hear all of the Brexit arguments. So I want to hear where they're coming from, so that I know how best to rebut them if it comes in an argument. So you made the analogy earlier of a legal trial. I want to see the other side's case, and I want to take it seriously, rather than just flicking through it and thinking, oh, this is just a load of rubbish. Because once I have seen the other side, that will make my case as strong as possible. And this is why I did this with my book, is I would rather my agent criticize my book than a lot of Amazon reviews saying this book is no good. So it's actually self-interested. It's not just saying, oh, I'm just open-minded about this. Because yes, people have limited time, and do they want to spend a lot of time listening to the other viewpoint? Well, certainly no, if you're just doing this on a perfunctory level. But yes, if your goal is to be informed, I actually become more informed when I hear the other side, compared to if I hear people who are just going to say the same thing as what I believe already.
I think what I like as well is, and you mentioned this later on in the book, about red teaming, which is exactly effectively what you were doing with regards to your agent. You're looking for the opportunity to challenge everything, to your point, and then when it comes to the Amazon reviews, because it's been challenged quite a lot, it's a lot more, let's call it, as Taleb would say, more anti-fragile as a direct result of that. What I'd love to do is just hear your perspective around truth for a second. When you think about objective truth, given the fact that we can't always get to objective truth, and politically, you can see plenty of examples where people on all sides of the aisle will make absolute bland statements that aren't even remotely close to objective reality, and yet so many people agree with it, and therefore almost it proves them true in one sense. I'd love to get your perspective over. So when you think about truth, how do you grapple with it? How do you think about it? And is it purely an objective truth there is, and that's what you're doing as a scientist to try to get to that? Or are you thinking through how can we win more people over towards understanding themselves and their own relationship to truth?
Yeah, so this is again a rich question. So I think it's very difficult to get to objective truth for things that we really care about. So at a simple level, yes, there are clearly truths. So this jumper is blue, it is not red. But many things that we discuss, those are interpretations of objective truths, and those interpretations may well be subjective. And so there are certain things which are presented as objective truths, but they may actually be interpretations. So let's say climate change is the world's greatest threat. So people would find it really difficult to deny this. We know about global warming, and to deny this, you'll be seen as a climate change denier, and that's problematic. That could get you cancelled. But saying climate change is the world's greatest threat is very different from what I would call an objective truth, which is when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to lead to global warming. Why is the latter much more of an objective truth? Because the former is more difficult. You're making a judgment. You're saying climate change is a greater threat than many other issues. So what might be another great threat? You could think about a pandemic. You might think of a nuclear war. And you also might think about things which are in contradiction to climate change. For example, right now there's 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity. And actually having some electricity, even if it's powered by coal, may well be valuable for them in terms of economic development. And if you deprive people from electricity, not only are their lives much lower quality, but actually all of their future descendants, you might be just pushing back an entire continent by centuries. That is a big threat, that threat to development and human flourishing. And so once we realise that actually many things that we think are objective truths are actually interpretations, then we have far less certainty and far more nuance than what you might think. And then what's the practical application of this? Often we see, again, the world in really black and white terms. We have policymakers, pressure groups who get a lot of support by saying, well, this is the only thing that we should care about. But actually you can't just stop oil. Why? Because many people do rely on oil, not just for jobs, but for electricity and economic development. We can't, for example, ban all flights except for essential medical flights. Why? Many people rely on the tourism industry for economic growth, and this might be in developing countries. Flying is really important for business reasons or for cultural exchange, for international students to get a greater understanding of the world. They will study in different countries. So often when we realise that the world is more nuanced, we're able to see the trade-offs, the textured colours in the issues which are often seen as black and white. So even if facts are objectively provable, the interpretations and the inferences are more subjective.
You have 3 great strategies to be able to deal with this black and white thinking. So black and white, again, is polarized thinking. It's whenever we think it's either this or this, and we tend to, once again, for reasons of efficiency, try to break things down to just 2 things. Now, you talk about moderation, being granular, and marble thinking. Could you share with us these 3 strategies? Because I think, again, they're really powerful ways of dealing with the world that seems black and white and making things more nuanced.
Certainly. So why is black and white thinking destructive? Well, the simple answer people give is the world is shades of grey. But let me again then decompose this and break this up into bite-sized chunks. Why is the world shades of grey? That's for the 3 reasons that you highlight. Number 1 is something I call moderation. So what does that mean in plain English? Well, often people think that something is always good or always bad, when it's actually only good up to a point or only bad after a point, which is why we have moderation. So one example might be drinking water during a marathon. So often people think, well, that is always good, we need to drink as much as possible, but there have been tragic cases where people have died because of water intoxication. They've drunk so much water that essential minerals have been diluted to fatal levels. So even something which seems good actually is only good up to a point. In contrast, something which is often lionized as bad may only be bad when it's extreme. For example, the Atkins diet claimed you should eat as few carbs as possible, when actually scientific evidence suggests that carbs are fine as long as they're about 30 to 50% of their daily calories. And actually, if people are not eating carbs, they might substitute for something else. And indeed, the Atkins diet is quite high in saturated fat. Dr. Atkins himself died, and one of the potential causes that people have ascribed when they looked at the autopsy was he had eaten too much saturated fat. So that's the idea of moderation. Something, even if it's unambiguously good to begin with, it's only good up to a point. The second example of why things are not black and white but shades of grey is what I call granularity. We often like to put everything under the same bucket, and we view everything under that bucket in the same way. For example, we might just call cholesterol bad, when actually there is good cholesterol and there's bad cholesterol. One is high-density lipoprotein, that's good, and low-density lipoprotein, which is bad. But just to call everything which is cholesterol bad, that's easy, because you only need to look at the cholesterol label on a food ingredients item to see whether to eat it or not. That might also be the same with carbs. Refined sugar is quite different from complex carbs, but if we were to demonize all carbs, as Atkins said, that's indeed easy. Just look at the carbs label on a box of food, and that tells you whether to eat it or not. The final example is what I call marbling, which is that something is mixed. It's not just good up to a point and then bad afterwards. It's not even clear whether it's good even in moderation. And why do I call it marbling? If you think about marbled meat, it's got streaks of fat intertwined with it. So if you're taking a bite, you don't know whether you've got the fat or whether you've got the meat. And one example might be fossil fuel companies. So if I'm a sustainable investor, often people think, well, let's completely boycott fossil fuels. But when you realize that right now, we don't have enough renewable energy to power the world, actually some fossil fuel stocks might be good. One company that's in the fund that I advise, which contributes the most to global warming, is a semiconductor company. Why? Because when you manufacture semiconductors, it releases a lot of perfluorocarbons into the atmosphere, and that's way worse than carbon dioxide in trapping heat. However, semiconductors can be used in solar panels. They could be the solution to global warming. So something which on the face of it looks really bad based on its carbon emissions actually might not be so bad when the product might avoid carbon emissions. So that is something we cannot classify as being black or white because it's marble that contains both good and bad elements.
That's great. And I love all three of those approaches. And I think that while you're giving great examples that are relevant to business and relevant to everyday choices, black and white thinking is actually regarded or known more as a cognitive distortion than a cognitive bias. In other words, it's known more as being one of the most important types of distorted thinking that we engage in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I think there's a massive amount of possibility for any of you who practice CBT of any nature, any of you who are grappling with anxiety or depression or stress. I think there's an enormous amount of potential in taking these three elements, the moderation, the granularity in terms of the marbled way of thinking, and to use those three approaches to be able to break down your own black and white thinking when it comes to the negative thoughts that you might have about yourself or about your relationships or about your life. One more element in the book is obviously the big framework. And this is the Ladder of Mis-Inference. And it's something that, quite honestly, I had to read a few times in order to get, right? Not so much the first part, a statement is not a fact, but there's the notion of a statement is not a fact. The fact is not necessarily data. Data is not necessarily evidence. Evidence is not necessarily proof. Could you quickly walk us through that and how it works? Because I think it's a remarkably useful way of being able to, stop lying to ourselves.
Thanks. So why did I come up with this idea of the Ladder of Mis-Inference? It's again based on the general notion of trying to simplify something complex into some bite-sized chunks which are memorable and actionable and implementable for the reader. So there's so many types of misinformation out there, and if my book was to say, well, here's the 157 ways in which you might be misled, then it's really hard for the reader to remember them all and to put them into practice. So I boiled down all of the types of misinformation into 4 categories, and I illustrate this in a graphic I call the Ladder of Mis-Inference. Why a ladder? Because when we start from some statements and we draw some conclusions from them, we are climbing a ladder. But I call this the ladder of, it's obviously a play on words on the ladder of inference, because sometimes the steps, the conclusions that we draw, may not be warranted. So let me just start with the first misstep, which is a statement is not fact because it may not be accurate. So what do I mean by this? We like to make statements all the time. We like to quote people all the time, but sometimes those quotes just have nothing behind it. Let's give an example. So in business, there's a very common phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's attributed to Peter Drucker, who's a very well-respected management guru. And often people say, well, this means that we should spend all of our time thinking about culture, don't care about strategy. And indeed, my work is on the importance of culture, so I should want to believe it. But actually, there's 2 problems. Number 1 is Peter Drucker never said this to begin with. It's attributed to him, but he never said anything even close to this. And there's loads of examples I'm sure the listener can think of misattributed quotes to people like Mark Twain or Thomas Edison and other influential people. But the second is more subtle. Even if Peter Drucker had said those words, it doesn't mean that it's true. Unless there was scientific evidence, he'd looked across hundreds of companies and shown that culture was a bigger predictor of success than strategy. The black and white idea that culture is always beating strategy is not supported by any evidence. Now, it may well be that Peter Drucker didn't need any evidence because he's such a big guru, but I would disagree with this because even some influential people do make mistakes. Not everything that a CEO says is always going to be correct. One could say, well, in Peter Drucker's subjective opinion, culture is more important than strategy, and that is a much clearer way of presenting it. But we often quote people, make statements, thinking that it's the gospel truth, and it's not. Now, the listener might say, okay, I get this. Maybe it's not academically correct that culture is more important than strategy, but maybe the general idea, which is he was conveying, is that we should pay more attention to culture than we think. Isn't that enough? And so am I just being too nitpicky? I don't think I'm being too nitpicky because sometimes this could be an issue of life and death. So, go to the opioid epidemic, which has killed 2 million people around the world. Why were opioids prescribed so liberally? Because they were highly addictive, whereas people thought they were not addictive at all. There was a study published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. The title was Addiction Rare in Patients Treated with Narcotics. And so people quoted this. They said, no, there's no addiction in narcotics. You can give people narcotics without causing some dependency on them. Was there any evidence behind it? Well, the answer is yes, but if you look at the evidence, what the evidence looked at was people who were in hospital. So maybe opioids are okay if you're given them as a controlled substance in a hospital, but if you're given them as an outpatient, they could be extremely deadly. So again, we like to quote things either without evidence, or even if there was evidence, we're not taking the context into account. So the idea of hanging on to a quote and because attributing it to a famous person or a famous journal like the New England Journal of Medicine, this does not mean that we can base decisions on that.
Right. And so the fact is not a statement, or a statement is not a fact. When it comes to the fact not being necessarily data and data not necessarily being evidence, could you just really quickly describe the difference between those 2 nuances?
Okay, so the next line is, a fact is not data, it may not be representative. So you might think from my first comment, well, all we need to do is a more thorough fact check the context, check with evidence behind it. But that's not enough, because even if something is 100% accurate, it might be the exception that does not prove the rule. For example, Simon Sinek says, starting with why is the secret to success. Here's some companies that started with why and they were successful. Let's say Apple and Wikipedia. But those are cherry picked. There could be hundreds of other companies that started with why and failed. And so that's why I say a fact is not data. It may not be representative. A couple of anecdotes doesn't tell you about anything in general. So you might think, well, the solution is to look at hundreds of companies to get the full picture, to get all of the data. and look in general, when I look at all of these hundreds of companies, are companies that have a purpose more successful? Well, the answer is again no, because of the third misstep up the ladder, which is data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. Even if you have a strong correlation in large-scale data, there could be multiple different interpretations. I talked about this earlier in terms of diversity and performance, but in terms of starting with why in success, is it starting with why leads to success? Or once you're already successful, we can spend time crafting a purpose statement because we're not firefighting. And finally, even though if I was to nail causality within the set of companies that I study, I have found, and it's definitive truth, that starting with why leads to success in the set of companies that I'm studying, which is large US public companies. There is the final misstep up the ladder, which is evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So a proof is universal. When Archimedes proved the area of a circle, that is true for all circles all around the world, and it's as true today as it was in the 3rd century BC. But evidence is often context-specific. Even if I show that starting with why leads to success in US large publicly traded companies, maybe it doesn't matter for a small startup. Maybe you just want to execute correctly rather than thinking about a why. Maybe this is not true in other countries around the world. Maybe we don't care so much about a purpose and a mission, we just want to get things done efficiently and effectively. But often these authors, they want to proclaim one universal truth which applies in every single context because they want as many people to buy their book as possible, when actually it may only be true in a small, limited setting.
Brilliant. Love that. Thank you so much, Alex, for walking us through that. Quick fire round. Your favorite movie?
This is for Avatar. So I like this because of the relationship with nature. I'm somebody who works on sustainability, so I enjoy that link with nature.
Fantastic. Favorite author?
So Stephen Covey, I like his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and his other leadership books. There have been books since then, like Atomic Habits and so on. I think they're all knockoffs of the original idea of Covey.
Favorite artist?
I have to say, let me answer this in an obtuse way. I would say Bruce Springsteen. So, a musical artist, because I know extremely little about visual art.
Join the club. Favorite philosopher?
Socrates. So I think he said it's a mark of an educated man to accept something to listen to something without necessarily accepting it. So it's always about trying to find what you don't know.
I knew you would pick Socrates. He's a legend. Favorite TV series?
So I love Law and Order, and this is not something for any educational reason, but I just find it really interesting. When I was young, I wanted to become a lawyer. I ended up in a very different path, but I like sort of looking at evidence and catching criminals and seeing the two sides to a story.
Fantastic. Just a few more. Favorite, if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
It would be teleportation. So I think the world is an amazing place and I just don't get to see all of it. And I don't love travel due to climate change and family reasons. And I'm lucky to get invited to give talks around the world, but I have to turn most of them down. So I'd love to be able to teleport.
Super. If you could have a time machine, when would you go to? Past, present, or future?
I go to the future. So I think that the world is... I think a lot of advances that people see, people often will criticize them, but I do think many of these things just do make life much more enriching and are additive.
Fantastic. Where would you live if not living where you're living?
I love Barcelona, so it's a city that I spend a lot of time in. I love the weather, the food, the pace of life, the fact that there's also like some nice parks like Parkway and like great architecture.
And I think I know the answer to this. What profession would you be in if you weren't doing what you're doing?
I don't know whether you know the answer. So I forgot that you know this. So I would be a football manager. So if ability was no object, I'd love that. So maybe as a kid, people love to be footballers, but I love the manager aspect because you can be motivated and select the team. And I played these computer games when I was young, like Championship Manager. So I enjoyed that aspect. So was that what you expected?
No, it's not. But I'm very impressed with the answer. What team do you support?
So sadly, I support Reading, which you would never support unless you had to by virtue of growing up there. So I grew up in Reading, this small town in England, 40 miles west of London. They did get to the Premier League, but after I'd moved to the US, I endured all the feedback from my friends when I was in the UK, and then I didn't get to enjoy the glory days. But I'm interested in what answer do you think that I would give?
I know. I thought just because what you said earlier that you'd be you want to be a lawyer, you know.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I was using logical inference from that. So lastly, what's one piece of advice you would give to everyone for dealing with the future, the AI future that we're expected to live in? If you could put it on a billboard, like what would be the one, like, this is what everyone needs to do?
It is a tool, but it's no more than a tool. So that might not seem to be a huge billboard moment, but I want to see these things in not black and white terms. People think it's either going to be completely useless, can't replace humans, or it's going to be completely transformative and render humans extinct. It is a useful tool. Like other useful tools like the calculator or the tractor or machines, they did not replace humans, but we were using them to supplement us. And that's certainly how I use it. So I will certainly not write stuff with AI, but I will get it to check my work. Or I might say, oh, I've used this word twice within the same paragraph. Can you vary it for me? If I try to get it to write stuff, then it will just probably not seem as authentic. It might not know the subject as well as I would.
Alex, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Anyone who is interested in critical thinking, being a better decision maker, or even looking to be able to think more clearly, you got to get Alex's book, May Contain Lies. It's an excellent book, highly recommended. And a big thank you to you, Alex, for taking the time out. I only got to some of the questions. Would love to, catch you at another time down the line in the future to have another conversation, because I really loved it. And thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks so much, Owen. I really enjoyed the conversation.